Good. Well, hi everybody. I'm Hayley Channer. I run the Economic Security Program at the US Studies Centre. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. The event tonight is called Building Bridges Across the Indian Ocean, Australia-India Cooperation for Connectivity and Growth. And talking about building bridges between countries and people, before we get started, I want to recognise the traditional custodians of the land that we're meeting on tonight. Indigenous Australians were not just the first explorers, navigators, farmers, engineers, and astronomers. They were also this country's first diplomats. And carrying on that fine tradition is our speaker tonight, Riya Sinha. Riya is a recipient of the Australian Government's inaugural Maitri Fellowship. The Maitri Fellowship program supports leading Indian think tankers to undertake secondments within Australian think tanks. And it was a highly competitive process, and Riya was selected out of a very large and accomplished field. So we were super lucky to have her at the Study Centre. When Riya's not a fellow with us, she's an associate fellow with a think tank in New Delhi. It's called the Centre for Social and Economic Progress, CSEP. And Riya has extensive experience in foreign and economic security policy. She's advised a lot of Australian government officials that go to New Delhi and officials from other countries. And she also conducts time-release studies and research on port logistics and infrastructure. For the last 6 months with us at the Centre, Riya's been undertaking research to better understand how Australia and India can cooperate to strengthen port infrastructure in the Indian Ocean, particularly the northeast Indian Ocean. And this is an area that the Centre hasn't done a lot of research in the past, but it's also a sort of under-researched area. And Riya is I would say, a world leader in understanding port connectivity, modernisation, climate resilient infrastructure, and financing mechanisms for ports in the Indian Ocean. And that is pretty extraordinary because when you think about it, there is so much ship transits and also cargo transported around the Indian Ocean. And Australians who are on the East Coast don't really think about the Indian Ocean. We think about the Pacific, or we think about the South China Sea. Probably people in Perth think a lot more about the Indian Ocean than we do. So we're really lucky that we have someone from New Delhi who is an expert in this area to explain to us what the key issues are in a region that is becoming more and more critical, not just for trade and connectivity, but also from a strategic standpoint of more military bases in the Indian Ocean Rim and more military exercises in that region. In particular, Riya's report, which you can see an executive summary for just outside the door, focuses on improving supply chains and actually strengthening the bonds between Australia and India to counter these geostrategic trends. Before I ask Riya to give an overview of her research, I also want to acknowledge some special holidays today. So I want to wish everyone a happy Diwali. Diwali is a holiday celebrated by several religions, particularly Hindus. It's a celebration of light, signifying the triumph of light over darkness and good over evil. And Diwali is just like Christmas for Christians. So it's a really, really big deal. But I also think that Diwali connects with another holiday that we're celebrating today because it's about the triumph of good over evil, and that holiday is Halloween. So let me wish everyone a very happy Halloween. And I know a lot of people that have children weren't able to come tonight because their kids are out trick-or-treating. And they don't realise that if they came here tonight, they would hear a true horror story. And that horror story takes place over a vast and not so desolate body of water called the Indian Ocean. The scary underdevelopment of infrastructure in the region is giving its residents, including India and Australia, nightmares. And countries around the Bay of Bengal region have been haunted by the prospect of needing to attract trillions of dollars by the end of this decade just to support the current level of growth. So, okay, we're hearing a horror story tonight. And with that, I want to invite Riya to actually take us through this story of what's happening in the Indian Ocean region, why Australia and India need to focus on this region. So Riya, can you tell us, what are the primary strategic and operational challenges that India is facing in this region? And why should India and Australia be looking at this particular region now?
Thank you, Hayley. And before I answer your question, first of all, thank you to USSC and to the Center for Australia-India Relations that has brought me to Sydney, to Australia, and helped me conduct this research that I've been working on in India for the past several years. And here I feel an important gap on how Australia and India can partner in terms of collaboration, cooperation, consultation to build infrastructure in the Indian Ocean region. And Hayley, what a description! If you were to talk about infrastructure and the lack of infrastructure to the government in India and Australia, on that, I'm sure they'll take it much more seriously and probably pool in more resources to overcome this major challenge. So this research, and to come to your question, this research was basically in the neighborhood. The Indian Ocean region is India's priority. It's India's first circle of influence. It's India's it's India's sphere of security. It's a first line of defense for that India sees itself as placed in the Indian Ocean region, and that is being eroded slowly with the increasing geoeconomic competition, geopolitical competition, with the lack of freedom of navigation, with issues like piracy, terrorism, and also on the non-traditional security side, on climate side, on the lack of infrastructure and other countries coming in and filling in the gap in not so in terms which are neither favorable for the smaller countries in the region and nor for India's own strategic objective. So this region is gaining, has always been important for India, but it's also gaining a lot more importance, say, for the Quad countries and the region where the interests are converging, and one of the key players over there is China, right? For the the key issues, the freedom of navigation, on developmental issues. I mean, the region requires $6.3 trillion by 2030 to maintain 6% levels of growth, the current levels of growth. And where are these resources going to come from? India cannot match China dollar to dollar. The smaller countries are pooling in resources from different places on different contractual agreements, on different obligations. And that has made this Indian Ocean space very, very complicated to work in. And that's why my research focuses on just one aspect, port infrastructure, because most of the countries, they are maritime nations. They are dependent on maritime imports and exports. So any underdeveloped ports, uncompetitive ports in the region are actually raising the cost of doing trade, which means they are making the development much, much more expensive in these countries. And without addressing the key infrastructure issues, which are the basic issues, it's very difficult to address the remaining developmental challenges. So this is just one part of the issue in the Indian Ocean region that I address in the report, and in the larger scheme of things. But I did think that this is a scalable opportunity. The areas of interventions are several. You can start at a smaller scale in the port ecosystem, from capacity building to actually going forward and building the infrastructure, working on the efficiency parameters. So this is a scalable opportunity where countries can work together, pool in resources, use their best practices to help the developing countries in the region.
Yeah, I mean, this area of research and the need that's required, I think people often forget how much trade is increasing, and Australia is a trading nation. And we know that there's about 10 billion tons of cargo that's transported around the Indian Ocean region every year. A lot of that is crude oil. So it's really about energy and transport and just basically keeping the wheels moving for everybody. Riya, you mentioned the Quad, and the Quad, this group of Australia, India, Japan, and the United States, they've been working together more frequently. But I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about the Quad in particular, what they're doing in the Indian Ocean region, what their strategic interests are in this region, and also if there's more convergence or divergence between any particular Quad members, like Australia and India, for instance. Are we always seeing eye to eye on Indian Ocean issues? So yeah, your thoughts on the Quad?
That's very interesting, especially after the Quad summit that took place recently. There were a lot of reporting that the Quad is effective, it's not, how the member countries working together. So in terms of Quad, there are both areas of convergences and divergences. The strength of Quad lies in the fact that, or at least I'm mostly talking from an Indian perspective over here, but the strength in the Quad lies in the fact that it is an institution and not an organization, which means it can have a lot of flexibility in the way Quad engages on different matters. From an Indian perspective, the convergence is on the side that Quad is for the delivery of public goods. It's for maintaining freedom of navigation. It is for delivering on health, on cybersecurity, on infrastructure, on humanitarian assistance and disaster resilience. These are the focus areas for India when it comes to Quad. And this is something that all Quad countries also converge on, that yes, the Quad is there to provide public goods, to provide options to the developing countries in this Indo-Pacific region. The divergence comes from a key factor, which is China, and how different countries in the Quad look at China. India's stance is that India has an ongoing border situation with China. It's been resolved to a very, very small extent right now, just on a patrolling issue a few days back. But the fact is that Chinese troops are stationed on India's northern borders, and how India talks about China that directly impacts its national security. And that's why that's why you'll see India stands on the Quad and the strategy. China is never named in the Quad. There may be harsher sentences used in terms of freedom of navigation, free and open Indo-Pacific, and sovereignty of the country's territorial integrity, but China is never named in the statement. This Quad statement was particularly harsher on China in terms of the language it used compared to the previous one. But yeah, and also on Russia, right? Even in reference to the Russia-Ukraine war, Russia is not named because Russia has been an ally for India for a very long time, but the other three countries of Quad look at it very differently. So of course, there has been a lot of talk and debate about, is India a reliable partner in Quad? Does these specific things, the fact that India exercises strategic autonomy, engages with the different countries differently, does it make Quad weaker with India's presence? I would say no, because Quad's focus should be on the delivery of public goods, but that's my own take. Quad should not focus on security, because for Quad to be effective, it has to look at the region that it's engaging in. And that is, I mean, it has a lot of developing countries, it has island states whose primary focus is development and not security. So if India goes with an Indo-Pacific, for example, with a Quad lens, or with a Quad tag towards its development needs in these countries, it may face resistance. So it's very important how you package initiatives in Quad and how you package Quad as a whole. So countries will have convergences and divergences, but I mean, at the end of the day, at least it's about providing public goods.
Yeah, that's the challenge with the Quad. I mean, there's a lot of challenges with the Quad, but it sounds like not only is there a need for those four countries to work together because they're worried about China's rise in a way that China creates instability and basically upends the current order. But the other issue is the real development need that China has been providing in places like the Indian Ocean, supporting countries like Sri Lanka with the port of Hambantota through China's Belt and Road Initiative. Riya, you mentioned before how India's had problems with China on the shared border region. China has been making incursions into India's territory and kind of literally testing the boundaries. Can you talk a little bit about, instead of like the development need that we've talked about for ports, you know, just actual infrastructure that's needed, from a strategic perspective, what has China's activities been like in the Indian Ocean? Why is it a cause for concern? And what type of activities, you know, not on land with the border, but in the maritime space, is India witnessing China do?
So do you want questions now? Or?
How does BRICS compare to Quad? That includes Russia and China.
Yeah.
So which is the most important from India's point of view?
Once I'll answer and come to that. Yeah, I'll come to that one. So in terms of how the challenges that India is facing with respect to China, especially in its neighborhood, one of the key areas is infrastructure development. Whether it's transport infrastructure, energy infrastructure, digital infrastructure, China is heavily present in India's neighborhood. In fact, when we looked at the data pre-2003, China was pretty much absent, and Chinese and Indian initiatives, especially in the South Asian region part of the Indian Ocean region, was pretty much equal. But it starts to diverge, and China starts to increase its presence in different sectors, especially in India's neighborhood. So if I talk about the port sector, all of India's neighboring countries right now have a Chinese port, from Myanmar to Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Pakistan. India is surrounded by Chinese ports, and these are big ports, right? And these are big ports, and two in Sri Lanka. In fact, one is Hambantota, and other is the East Coast Terminal in Colombo. This is a strategic challenge to India. It's a challenge to India's trade because a lot of India's transshipment takes place in Sri Lanka. The goods coming in and out of India, they go either via Sri Lanka or via Singapore at times. So this really creates a challenge for India's trade connectivity and supply chains.
And the capacity of those ports.
And the
is-
capacity
yeah.
of those ports, in fact. What India has been trying to do, especially in the last 10 years, India has come out with these policies of neighborhood first, Act East policies, and an acronym called SAGAR, which stands for Security and Growth for All in the region, specifically focused on infrastructure investments in its neighborhood. So in the last decade, in fact, India has built 6 railway lines with Bangladesh, which didn't exist. India has started building ports in the neighboring countries, which it didn't do before. It's also in India that it ignored the neighborhood for a very long time, and the initiatives have just started in the last 10 to 12 years. But now India is stepping up to counter the Chinese threat. But of course, the scale is very different. If I just talk about the port sector, if China is building an entire port in Sri Lanka, India is only building one terminal at Colombo port. So the scale differs because that is these are the only resources and the capacity that India has at the moment. And the East Coast, the West Container Terminal in Sri Lanka is also built with the support of US, the Development Finance Corporation, which provided $550 million recently. So that's why there is a need that India recognizes as to counter China. One is that India needs to step up its presence in the neighboring countries. So whether it's giving $4 billion support to Sri Lanka during the financial crisis, continuing the conversation right now with Bangladesh despite the political crisis, engaging with Nepal despite the change in government. This is something that India has not done before. But it is increasingly realizing that India's own growth, India's own target of becoming a $5 trillion economy is linked to its neighboring countries. And this is also in India today that realizes that it has to work with external players in the region. It doesn't have the resources. 10 years ago, or even 15 years ago, if you had asked me, can US and India, Australia and India work together in the Indian Ocean region, I would have said no. India was not comfortable working with external players in the region, especially in its neighborhood. Today, it's very different.
It is amazing, the transformation in the last decade. I mean, literally, Ria is here in this room because our government decided to fund a fellowship program, and that is different. You know, there's a real stepping up in the relationship, and that's because the dynamics in the region are changing. There is more competition because China is becoming more affluent and it's trying to assert itself and also get involved more in ways that we haven't seen before. So that's changing dynamics between like friendly countries. We talked about, BRICS came up, as well as other groups that are in the region. Ria, your report talks about a couple of other groups, including BIMSTEC and IORA. In international affairs, a lot of the time it can be like alphabet soup, trying to remember what the acronyms stand for. But, you know, can you talk a little bit about these other regional groupings, BIMSTEC and IORA? Firstly, explain what they are in just terms that anybody could understand. And what are all these groups trying to do, you know, from BRICS to BIMSTEC to IORA?
So first, let me come to BRICS. So, I mean, let me paint the big picture of where India stands when it comes to regional institutions. So India was a late player when it came to engaging with regional institutions. It was a reluctant player. It was especially in the regional institutions which comprised of its neighborhood. India always saw that as a security threat of neighboring countries ganging up against India. So there was a different driver, say back in the 1980s and 1990s, why India embraced regional institutions. Last 10 years, it's been a very different region because because of India's own foreign policy and strategic objectives. One, India wants to become the regional leader of the global South. Second, a seat at the United Nations Security Council. And third, to become a $5 trillion economy. These ambitions mean that India needs to be a part of groupings, which it was uncomfortable with before. So in the last 10 years, India has joined 36 different plurilateral groups.
Oh my God.
Capacity is questionable. We have 900 diplomats who are overstretched currently, but India is showing its willingness to engage with different countries who are not partners, who are not always like-minded countries on different platforms. So BRICS being one of them. In fact, India was very upset a few years ago with China when China included South Africa in BRICS without consulting any of the other members. But today, India participates very actively in BRICS. 40% of the global economy is represented by BRICS, and it's an expanding institution. It fits into India's agenda of not agenda, but an aim of being in the global South, of being seen as a voice of global South or as a regional leader of the global South. So BRICS fits into India's objectives in that way. Sorry.
Oh, let's wait just to the end.
Can I complete and then?
No, she's going to finish.
Yeah. The other regional institutions, BIMSTEC, for example, Bay of Bengal Multi-Sectoral Technical and Economic Cooperation Initiative. It's a small regional, it's a regional grouping of all the Bay of Bengal countries in the Indian Ocean region, which India has been actively promoting since 2016. BIMSTEC existed since 1997. India did not participate. It did not have a charter till 2 years ago, till last year even, in fact. So these are areas which India is leading. India is developing, IORA being one of them. India is now working with Australia and IORA, for example, in the Maritime Safety and Security Group. India has worked with IORA on trade facilitation, and these were initiatives that India did not take before. Yes, it requires a lot of capacity. It requires engaging with different partners, but India is also relying on these institutions for its own growth. One, for its own growth, and second, also it's a demand from the smaller countries in the region that they are more comfortable engaging through regional institutions with more structured and more norms, rather than bilaterally with countries where they've had problematic relations with India or other Quad members, even in fact.
Okay, let's move away from the regional mechanics of how India and Australia are trying to engage and actually talk about the infrastructure itself. So in particular, let's talk about the deficit and what kind of investment is needed, because if we know the challenges and we know the frameworks that are already in place to try and address it, we also need to know what is actually required and why hasn't it already been fixed. So for example, in ports, transportation and energy, what have been the obstacles to developing more sustainable infrastructure, and how could Australia and India work together to address those gaps?
So different levels of challenges that have existed in the region. One is, of course, the political instabilities. Now, these are developing countries. These are countries which have seen some of them 7 leaders in the last 10 years. So these countries are they are vulnerable to political volatility, and therefore they have to be, especially what's happening in Myanmar, what's happening in Bangladesh in the neighborhood, for example. There has to be different mechanisms of dealing with the countries. There can't be one model or based on norms and values. And I think India was a little late to understand it, but it did. So, I mean, one of the bigger discussions in Indian foreign policy space is, for example, do we only engage with democracies or do we engage with everyone? And you'll see that trend is changing, where India does engage with a lot of different kind of countries with different governance models. So political instability has always been a challenge, because if you engage with one government, and I'll give an example of this, if you engage with one government and the government changes, and what happens to the connectivity initiative? What happens to the billions that have been put in? Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay.
Sorry, I'll slow
So much
down.
information to get through.
So, for example, with Bangladesh, with the current change in regime, former Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina, she was known as a friend of India, an ally of India, and most of India's connectivity initiatives with Bangladesh, whether it was in railways, roads, fourth sector, the energy initiative, digital, all took place because of close relations with former Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina. Now, this was a big question that came up recently, that what will happen with the regime change in Bangladesh? Because the interim leader, Muhammad Yunus, was historically is not known as a pro-India leader. But the good thing about these connectivity initiatives is that they're known to be resilient, because when you invest in connectivity initiatives over 10 years, trade linkages are established, value chain linkages are established, it's very difficult to de-link them. And this is something that is coming out in the India-Bangladesh relations today, where railway lines, have been suspended for other reasons, but road transport started within a few weeks. People-to-people exchanges started within a few weeks of border closing. So this is the kind of resilience that infrastructure and connectivity initiatives show in the region. In terms of other challenges, political instability being one of them, but other challenges also include access to finance. Multilateral banks have been engaged in the region for so long. They've highlighted these issues for so long, but it's always been a challenge for these countries to adhere to the conditions and norms and standards set by the multilateral banks. And that's where players like India, they come in. And that's where China has also been able to make headway, because this region was ignored for a very long time because they were not seen as being capable enough to adhere to certain conditions or standards. So China's money was seen as easy money to develop infrastructure. India's money was seen as in a smaller scale, seen as easier to get with less number of conditions. But that is slowly changing, but access to finance is one of the biggest issues that needs to change in the region.
You can understand if a country has several prime ministers, like at one stage we did, and you sort of cycling through different prime ministers, how big projects that take a decade or 2 decades to build can get stalled, or, as what usually happens with politics, they get rebranded or renamed. Basically, the new government puts a new stamp on it, or upends the progress. So you can see if there's been political instability, all of those development priorities would be stalled as well. But Riya, I'll ask 2 quick more questions and then we'll go to audience questions, because it'll be really good to hear what the audience wants to ask. But you mentioned finance, and a lot of the time that you spent here in Australia for the last 6 months, you've been speaking with the Australian government about what Australia is doing already in the region to finance different infrastructure projects. Now, Australia for a long time has tried to compete with China's Belt and Road Initiative, but just like India, we don't have anywhere near the funds that China has to bring to bear. The only activity on the sort of Pacific side of things that Australia has done has been undersea fibre optic cables, basically trying to connect different Pacific Island countries so that they have secure communications, which you rely on for everything, basically. I mean, if you don't have an internet or phone lines, you can't get to talk to anybody and you can't do any banking transactions. So in terms of what Australia's been doing in the Indian Ocean and Australia's investment there, different programs, what is India's perspective on Australia's development assistance to the Indian Ocean? Does India feel like this is a complementary thing or a competitive thing? What's the story?
So 2 parts to this story. One is that, and this is something I highlight in my paper as well, that there's a huge gap in terms of what is Australia able to do in the region. It's not been a traditional player in the Indian Ocean region, Australia, and even in fact, Australia's development program in the Indian Ocean region has been very limited, modest in scale. So it's neither India nor the smaller countries in the region actually currently see Australia as being a reliable partner, for example, as a first partner that comes to mind, for example, when it comes to filling development needs. And that is something that needs to change, because in my own fieldwork over here, going to different spaces, talking to people, there is considerable expertise. If I just talk about the port sector, the logistics and mining, automation is one of the bigger industries over here that can be leveraged in the developing countries, because that is something that even India doesn't have, for that matter. And Professor Elnaz is here, and she's worked a bit on this, and she was helpful in my research. So the first thing that needs to be done is to fill the knowledge gap between what are the capabilities that exist in Australia. Sure, Australia-India bilateral is growing. Their foreign ministers are meeting, commerce ministers are meeting, education ministers are meeting, but actually at the ground level, not a lot is changing. Bilaterally, trade has grown to a certain extent, but how do you take it beyond? How the next step would be to make India and Australia work in a third country, in the Indian Ocean region. And the first step towards that is to bridge that knowledge gap. Second is, of course, I understand that, Australia's strategic priorities are the Pacific and not the Indian Ocean, and therefore the amount of resources that it can invest in the region is going to be limited. But we also have to look at scalable opportunities, something that I identify in my report, different mechanisms to work with it, because India is comfortable working with Australia. Australia doesn't have a historical baggage in the Indian Ocean region, the way the US has, for example. So there is potential to work in the region. It's just that both countries need to sit together and talk how they're going to work, how they're going to work in in triangulation in a third country. Yeah, I mean, I could say give more money, but let's not go there.
Yeah, every time there's a problem, governments gets asked to put more money towards it, but sometimes that doesn't solve the problem, because actually the problem, not only is it not enough money, but it's a coordination problem. So if you're thinking about Quad cooperation, not only are you cooperating with 4 different countries, you're cooperating with multiple departments within those countries who are responsible for doing infrastructure. Okay, one more question, and then I would love to hear audience questions. So my last question, actually, one thing that I've always really enjoyed hearing, Riya, since you've been here, is some practical realities around ports, because I don't know anything about ports. I've never been to ports like you've seen them physically, and I don't understand about capacity, depth, their ability to actually receive goods, their ability to be militarized, so to have visits from Navy ships. So can you give the audience just a sense of the lack of capacity and more of a sort of practical understanding of the physical restrictions that ports in the region are facing, and what is needed to fix them, like listing things like modernization and just digitization, that type of thing, like in a practical sense?
Okay. Okay, just to simplify how trade through ports is affecting our everyday lives, for example, and that's what got me very passionate about ports, realizing in my first port visit that each and every movement has a cost, and if that movement is inefficient, it is the user, it's the end use consumer that's paying the cost. Simple example, one of my first observations was at one of India's biggest container ports, Jawaharlal Nehru Port. It's in Mumbai. Apples were lying there for 21 days. And for 21 days, apple lying in a refrigerated container meant that the consumer at the end in the market was going to pay the ground rent, which was incurred by those 21 days. And just that realization that if you change smaller processes, if you change little clearance, it doesn't require building big infrastructure. It doesn't always require putting billions into building a new port or new infrastructure. It's just smaller tweaking of processes, digitizing the paperwork, for example, so that an agent does not have to run through 5 different agents, 5 different places to get something signed, and eventually it will be cleared after 3 days. When it can be done, when it can be done in a matter of half an hour if the process is digitized. Infrastructure remains one of the bigger challenges in the region because of the factors of geography and the resources that our ports are very old. Ports, particularly in the Indian Ocean region, they're very old. So they don't have enough draft, enough depth for bigger vessels to come in. That means that transshipment takes place either in Singapore, in Sri Lanka, or in Dubai for all the goods coming into that region. And without that kind of infrastructure, there's an additional cost. Every time a container is transshipped to another ship, that's a cost. And that comes to the end user again. In terms of port processes, for example, again, getting back to that customs processes, customs clearance processes. In a country like Australia, for example, the paperwork clearance happens even before the goods arrive in the country, which means that when the goods arrive, they can immediately leave the port. That's not the case in many Indian Ocean countries because they're not being trained to, they don't have the capacity right now or don't have enough training to assess the security threats. Here, systems are doing that, right? In those countries, those systems don't exist, or even the manpower is not trained enough to identify the markers in those systems. But if these things were streamlined, I think the cost of logistics would go down immensely in the countries, which currently stands at 20% of GDP. And that's a huge thing. It's 8% in the US. It's much lower. It's around the same figure in Australia. So the common people are losing a lot of money to this bigger logistics cost that comes because of inefficient port ecosystem.
I often feel like working here at Sydney Uni that we have such a large bureaucracy that we are losing 20% productivity just by filling in university forms all the time. But with that, thank you so much. Let's open it up to questions. I mean, we've heard about the Quad, China's Belt and Road, BRICS, investment and apples. So please, questions from the floor. And would you just let us know your name?
It's Kabir. Oh, sorry.
And sorry, we've got people watching online too, so we'll need you just to use a mic, even though it's a small, intimate room.
It's Kabir. Many years ago, I was a tutor here, and I'm thinking about how far back the link with India goes. My supervisor at the time was Herman Black, who later became Vice Chancellor here. And one of his proudest movements was the Colombo Plan program, which he thought was a wonderful step. And I remember when I was doing my master's degree here in development economics, two professors, Warren Hogan and Ted Wheelwright, both of whom delivered their lectures on India and Indian economic development. So, and I'm surprised, there was I remember Debesh Bhattacharya was a lecturer here. Manmohan Singh came and gave a talk, and he was still finance minister before he became prime minister. So there was quite a depth. But I don't see that that has been built on or developed or taken further. That's one point. And I don't know why.
Australia?
Yeah, in Sydney University, this was all in Sydney. I don't know what else was happening elsewhere, but just there. But the other point I was going to ask about too is India's policy on tariffs and how that would interfere with trade, particularly with Australia, given the similarity of many of the products that they would trade in. Could you comment on either or both of those in terms of what you think that reflects about our relationship with India, and if that would be a barrier? Thanks.
On the first part, on the knowledge gap about India, I mean, that's something that I also experienced in these 6 months here, that perhaps there's a lot more gap to be filled in terms of just understanding each other's countries. But the good thing is that step has taken place. I mean, I'm here because of that reason, because there's a growing interest in India. There's a growing interest in how India works. There's a growing interest in how the private sector can be engaged in India. The Australian private sector can go to India. In fact, it was after coming here. In India, we don't talk about Australia a lot. We talk about US a lot, sure. We talk about Japan a lot, but not Australia. So it's both ways, that the Indian knowledge in Australia has to grow, but the Australian knowledge in India also has to grow to a very large extent. In fact, one of the examples that I always give is I've been working on the port sector for 10 years on the biggest Indian port, the Jawaharlal Nehru port. I did not know in all of these 10 years that the P&O Ports Australia had built one of the container terminals. It was only after coming here that I learned that. These kind of exchanges are not taking place, and I think it needs to start at the university level first, offering an India course, for example. I don't think Sydney University even offers a course on India, for example. I was talking to somebody at University of Melbourne, and they mentioned that they used to offer and then they stopped offering it. So it has to start at the university level first, and of course, G2G engagements will go on. It's a good relationships the ministers enjoy, the ministers have known each other for years in different capacities, and therefore they do have a good relationship. But then how do you make it grow at a practical level, so that without the university knowledge filling in, I don't see how that's going to go forward. The good thing is the step has taken place. A lot of money is being invested in it. So perhaps we can reassess in another 5 years if something changes or not. But yeah, I mean, that's for your first question. On tariffs, so India's policy on tariffs has changed. It was earlier following the global rules, but one thing that has changed in the last 10 years for India is that it has started negotiating free trade agreements again. India was completely against free trade agreement or even giving any tariff concessions, mainly because India thought that none of these benefited India. I mean, if you would talk about tariffs in the Ministry of Commerce or even FTAs in the Ministry of Commerce, it was considered a bad word even 6 years ago. Today, that's not the case. India has negotiated FTAs with 8 countries, one with Australia, and ECTA with Australia. Now, these are limited FTAs at this point, but India is going towards, at least India sitting at the negotiating table. Especially for the Indian Ocean countries, India does provide tariff concessions to a lot of these Indian Ocean countries. There is a tariff concession for South Asia. With Bangladesh, 98% of the lines are tariff-free. It's India's biggest trading partner when it comes to its neighborhood. So India is slowly liberalizing it. But one thing about India is that it has big institutional memory. So the grievances of the past don't go very easily, and therefore the process are sometimes very slow. But the good thing is that, the negotiations are taking place. India-UK is taking place. India-EU is taking place. India-Australia, ECTA, the Economic Comprehensive Treaty Agreement, is the 11th round of negotiation is going to take place in November. And then after a few rounds, it will be upgraded to a full FTA. So we are reaching there. We are on that path to liberalize the tariffs.
Sounds like a long process. Tom.
Thank you. I had 2 quick questions. One was around,
You're on.
okay, cool. One was around climate kind of resilience, I guess. And obviously, like, sea level rise is going to impact ports. That's kind of no surprise. But I guess I was curious how much, obviously, there's a need to improve the infrastructure itself already. Is the kind of forward planning for worsening weather conditions or worsening weather patterns and sea level rise, et cetera, being factored into how both India, but I guess also other players like China in the region are building that infrastructure? Or is there any risk, I guess, of some countries being stuck with port infrastructure that's been upgraded and then doesn't work or function as well in 20 years? The other question I had was around overall infrastructure spending. Obviously, more money is always better. But does India have any kind of challenge or tension with its own domestic infrastructure kind of rollout and ambitions, and also providing support for broader, I guess, throughout the region infrastructure funding as well? Is that a tension at all or not? Yeah.
Next question. Thank you, Tom. For the first part of your question, on climate, so climate resilience is actually not featuring in a lot of conversations on infrastructure right now, mainly because there is a lack of infrastructure itself. So it's a conversation between having the volume, or do we make it sustainable? Where do we spend the money? Do we spend the money in creating more infrastructure, or do we make in greening the infrastructure? Some initiatives have taken place. I wouldn't, so India led the establishment of the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, for example, and port resilience is a part of that. Green shipping agreements is something that's green shipping is part of the Quad is one of the parts of the Quad grouping as well. But the conversations are still at a very nascent stage in the region, because this also requires the countries to, again, greening itself is a cost, right? So first of all, it requires countries to build the standards for greening. And that is somewhere that I feel Australia can also step in. So despite the fact that Bangladesh can say it wants green ports by so-and-so year, or Sri Lanka said it wants green port, but the current infrastructure initiatives are not geared towards that. That's not a conversation that's happening in the region. And mainly because of the lack of resources of how to think about it. And having more ports or better ports than having green ports, that's more important. Second part of your question, that's a good question. And that is something that India has been able to, I would say, manage very effectively in the last 10 years, at least from what I have been analyzing so far, because a lot of India's policies when it comes to domestic infrastructure development also factor in what will take place in the neighborhood. I mean, just Small example, India had elections earlier this year, right? And one of the agenda in the BJP's manifesto was connectivity with the neighboring countries, improving that. So it's happening at all levels. So if India has a domestic port connectivity policy called Sagarmala, it also looks at connectivity with the neighboring countries. India has a railway connectivity plan, which is called the dedicated freight corridor. Parts of the dedicated freight corridor also go to the neighboring countries. So they're trying to align both initiatives. Different departments in India have different assessments about how they want to go about it and where they want to prioritize and expend the resources. But at least the neighboring countries are being made a part of the plan when it comes to, especially when it comes to domestic, I mean, including in the domestic development front.
I feel even less sorry for the people who decided to go trick-or-treating tonight and not come here to attend this event. Other questions? Yes, sir. Oh, sorry, could you wait for the mic? Yeah.
Can you hear me? Okay.
Perfect.
All right. Thank you very much for this. And actually, I'm very keen in looking at the cooperation because I think bridges you build with cooperation, not with thinking about security, how they might be destroyed. So, and I understand your priority in terms of, yes, greening is important, but let's keep that priority to those that actually then destroyed that things, the planet, like UK, US, and others that actually did most of the pollution. So can you give me about, in terms of the priority values, how India sees the value of the cooperation between all these different groups? So BRICS, I believe at the moment is one of the fast developing, and they've got 9 members plus 13 actually joining soon. And how I understand also the other one, the regional, which is the BIMSTEC, which is the regional, which is natural, but probably doesn't have as much power, but it's good to have cooperation. And I believe the third one is absolutely not relevant for this topic because we are talking about cooperation. That one is for security. And the third one, I believe, I don't know enough, I believe is just for security. It's got no relation to building bridges and cooperation, right?
Which is the third one that you're talking about?
Oh,
Because
what's
we
Aurora?
talk about a lot.
Aurora? Aurora, okay, which is like, I believe the same thing. So that quad is probably, Japan might be valuable because they transfer goods regarding the ports. But Australia, I don't think it's a big player in terms of ports because I don't think we export much other than minerals, and that goes in China most. Food, again, mostly China. And we have practically very low value. And actually, I just can tell you that Australia is 72nd on the knowledge diffusion, which means like we don't bring enough value in terms of practical. So it's one is academic, another thing is how much is applied. And 93rd on the economic complexity. Yeah. So we are low level, like resources rather than. So what's most important here that I would like to answer is about supply chain, where actually both India and Australia might eventually join that supply chain. So actually we are both important because we don't want just to supply just minerals to China and we get all these final products. We need something in between.
Question about how can Australia and India work together to make their supply chains like more complex, not just
on a global level rather than just regional, because supply chain is actually about including everybody. It can go everywhere. Goods can be sold everywhere.
So maybe it's like, can goods that come out of India be value added in Australia, and can goods that come from Australia be value added in India, for instance?
In terms of enriching the value, because Australian minerals go somewhere instead that can be enriched rather than sending directly as raw here, or maybe partially in India, and they provide to China, with next level rather than,
That's the
The-
goal.
Okay.
Yeah.
So Riya, then, is there a way that Australia and India can be value adding to each other's exports?
Um, that's a difficult one to answer. I mean, that is the end goal, but of course, how to reach there is something that both countries, even at the Quad level, they are still discussing on how do we work together, because the technology, the processing technology does exist in China. 90% of the processing takes place over there. It's a huge conversation that even in Africa, for example, I mean, there's a scramble. I mean, there is so much interest in African minerals right now. China has invest. China owns mines in Africa, and India's private sector is trying to get into the mines in Africa. And so was Australia at one point. But the challenge over there is you can get the minerals, but the processing will still happen in China. And how do we make it? How do we stop that? In fact, that's something that even African countries are asking. That if you take the mines, process it on our own ground. So India is negotiating that with African countries. I don't know. I don't work in the critical minerals or mines area, so I don't know how that supply chain will exactly work, but I know that this is part of the discussion.
What about, could we take it a couple of steps back and actually just outline what are India's main exports for people that aren't really familiar with like the primary industries that India is the world leader in? I mean, there's IT, obviously.
IT and services are India's biggest exports, but in terms of the goods export, the biggest one is clothing and textiles. That's one of India's biggest exports. Furniture, the wooden products are one of India's biggest exports. But yeah, India is trying to improve the manufacturing within the country through the Make in India program in different sectors, in defense, in defense and technology. India is also trying to, on the services side, India is also trying to export the digital public infrastructure to the developing countries. But yeah, I mean, your question is a difficult one because I wouldn't know how to answer. How can they build complementarities? Because at one point you have this Make in Australia and then there is a Make in India, and they both want to de-risk from China and have manufacturing on their own shores. So the countries will really need to sit together and consult with each other how to work together.
Yeah. Semi-finished products. Yeah.
Yeah.
We have a couple more minutes.
To bring them together. I mean, Australia tried doing a bit of assembly work in China, and the stories I heard about, when the Australians went over there, I mean, the chap was having a washing machine built, about $700, $800, and it had to be moved. And so he dictated that there should be a strip of timber that big so it wouldn't fall over. When he went there, he found it was that big because the boss said he wanted to save money on a 10-cent piece of timber. I mean, it's a silly example, but bringing together culture, and Australia hasn't got a great manufacturing culture to add to anyway. I don't know what it would offer to India.
All right, we've got time for one more question before we all have to brave the outside elements. So make it a long question so that we don't have to go outside in the rain. Well, look, if there's no more from the audience, yesterday, Riya and I were in Canberra, and Riya presented her findings to the Australian government. Not only were they impressed, but they said that her independent work helps them change Australian government policy towards the right direction. So Riya is really influencing Australian policy with her expertise. And one of the audience members asked this cracker of a question, which was, what did you keep out of your report? What did you redact or not actually include in your report? And Riya had a great answer. So maybe I could ask that, or even like your final reflection, Riya, on being here for 6 months in Australia. Was there one particular thing that surprised you about the Australia-India relationship that maybe Australians wouldn't know? So maybe just your reflections on being here for 6 months and your main takeaway personally.
Well, look, this has been an incredible 6 months because it really allowed me to understand Australia firsthand and take that experience back to India, where one of, and I mentioned this yesterday, that, one of the major questions in the policy circles we are asked, and today this is India that's willing to work with different countries. They're like, how are other countries doing it? Or what are the capacities that exist in other countries? and how can India work with other countries? So that has helped. So being here for these 6 months has really helped me answer that question to some extent, because at least I have an understanding in the port infrastructure, in the port development sector, of where Australia stands, what are the complementarities that can be built in the Indian Ocean region with India. And yeah, I mean, the findings were, and how sometimes Australia and India even think on similar lines in terms of the capacity they have, the resources they have, and how the bureaucracy would think in a specific direction on how to engage and not to engage. But one of my biggest takeaways would be that, like I said before, knowledge building. It has to happen at a much bigger scale. If India and Australia have to find a way to work together. This geopolitical pivot, it will only last for so long. It can change. And if we do not capitalize on this particular movement, on this particular situation, it's a lost opportunity. Because these are two countries that have potential to work together to build complementarities. In the port sector, for example, India is building the West Container Terminal in Sri Lanka. They're not talking about greening the sector. Australia has an action plan for greening its ports. That's a place where complementarities can be built, but the countries are not talking about talking to each other for this, and that is because of a lack of knowledge. India does not see Australia as someone who will be talking about greening ports, because Australia is also not, these things are not part of the conversations. So I think a bit of strategic alignment on how to work with third countries is really needed at this point.
Riya, hold up your executive summary for everyone to see. If you would like a copy of this, please do take one on your way out. But can I really thank Riya and thank all of you, the audience, for coming tonight to support. Really appreciate it. Thank you very much. Thanks, Riya.
Thank you.